Imagine yourself in the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by nothing but water and silence. Your boat is your only protection against the unknown, but suddenly, everything begins to go wrong. No power, no help in sight, and every decision could mean the difference between making it home or never being found. This is the true story of a family who faced the unthinkable at sea. A rescue that almost became a tragedy and a miraculous reunion that no one could have predicted. It was late 1999, the world stood on the brink of a new millennium, and many families dreamed of starting fresh adventures. For Niels Blixenkronmaler, his wife Rika, and their 11-year-old son Rasmus, the idea of escaping routine seemed irresistible. The answer? A small 28-foot sailboat named Nuts. A name they chose humorously, reflecting both the tiny size of the boat and their belief that the idea itself was nuts. The Nuts, with its modest sails and cramped quarters, wasn't exactly the kind of vessel that inspired immediate confidence. But for Niels, a man with an adventurous spirit, it was more than enough. Safety lies in the details, not the size, he often said with a smile. Rika, with her practical outlook, and Rasmus, full of childlike curiosity, completed the crew for this journey. They were determined to turn the open sea into their home for an entire year. We wanted to give Rasmus something he would never forget, Niels explained years later. And the Nuts was the key to making it happen. A small vessel meant to carry the family from Europe to the Caribbean, across clear waters filled with unknown challenges. The plan was simple yet ambitious. Leave Europe, cross the Atlantic, and explore the Caribbean. It was a sabbatical year, far from commitments, routines, and the busy life on land. Above all, it was an opportunity to teach Rasmus lessons he could never learn in a classroom. The spirit of exploration, the patience of the sea, and the importance of confronting the unknown. The Nuts became more than a boat. It was a symbol of freedom, improvisation, and the promise of a different kind of life. While others sought comfort, the Blixenkronmaler family sought meaning. Their departure from the Canary Islands felt like the beginning of a dream. The Atlantic breeze pushed them gently westward, and each day seemed like a small chapter in a larger story. But as the sea often teaches, true adventure never comes without a touch of unpredictability. 10 days had passed since the Nuts left the Canary Islands en route to Barbados. The transatlantic crossing had been everything Niels, Rika, and Rasmus had hoped for. Sunny days, starry nights, and the constant sound of waves against the hull. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until something went wrong. Niels was the first to notice. The boat's engine, used sparingly to preserve the batteries, wasn't working. He tried to start it, but all he heard was the faint sound of an engine refusing to turn over. The batteries were nearly dead. Without power, the Nuts was in a precarious position. The solar panel, which was supposed to be their backup in emergencies, wasn't generating enough charge. The sails still propelled them, but without the engine, they were completely at the mercy of the wind and current. Niels, who was always calm under pressure, knew it was time to act before the situation worsened. He tried to reassure himself, "We still have food, water, and wind in the sails. But we can't stay like this for long." It was the beginning of a test that would push every family member, and the Nuts, to their limits. With no other options, Niels decided to use the Nuts radio to call for help. The radio, still powered by one of the last reserves of battery energy, was their only chance. He adjusted the frequency, searching until he heard distant voices. "Mayday, mayday, this is the sailboat Nuts," he called, his tone firm but anxious. There was a pause, an eternal silence, before a deep voice with a distinctive accent responded. It was the captain of a Pakistani cargo ship, sailing just a few miles away. After understanding the situation, the captain promised immediate assistance. He altered the cargo ship's course, a giant compared to the tiny Nuts, and began closing in. The radio crackled again. "We're on our way. Stand by for instructions." Aboard the Nuts, the mood was bittersweet. On one hand, there was relief knowing they weren't alone. On the other, the idea of relying on such a massive ship was intimidating. "Will they help us, Dad?" Rasmus asked, his wide eyes filled with worry. "Yes," Niels replied, "but we need to be ready for what comes next." When the cargo ship appeared on the horizon, its immense size was breathtaking. For Niels and his family, The vessel seemed more like a floating city than a simple transport ship. The small Nuts, with its worn sails, looked even smaller as the giant drew near. The cargo ship's captain gave instructions over the radio. "Stay where you are. We'll throw lines to tow you." Despite the calm tone, Niels knew the maneuver was risky. A sailboat as small and fragile as theirs wasn't equipped to handle the force of such a massive ship. Heavy ropes were tossed from the ship's deck, landing in the water with a hollow splash, dangerously close to the Nuts. Niels, with steady hands, managed to grab one. But he quickly realized the current and the ship's movements were pulling the sailboat dangerously close to the steel hull. Tension aboard the Nuts was palpable. "Hold tight," Niels shouted, trying to keep the boat stable. Rika held onto Rasmus, who stared wide-eyed at the enormous hull that seemed ready to swallow the boat whole. The sound of the ship's engines reverberated through the water, a constant reminder of how precarious their situation was. The worst happened in a matter of seconds. As the cargo ship maneuvered to align with the sailboat, the Nuts was caught in the currents forming around the ship. The small vessel rocked violently, and before Niels could react, its mast collided with the cargo ship's hull. The sound of braking would echoed through the air, a noise that made Rika scream instinctively. The Nuts' mast, which held the sails and symbolized the pride of the small boat, was destroyed. The vessel was now little more than a floating shell, adrift. Niels desperately tried to steer the boat away, but the ship's proximity made it impossible. "We're too close to the propellers," he shouted, realizing that if they didn't move soon, the Nuts could be sucked in and completely destroyed. The radio crackled again with the captain's voice. "Abandon the boat. Get aboard immediately." For Niels, those words felt like a death sentence for the Nuts. But he knew his family's safety came first. "Let's go, everyone up," he ordered, his heart heavy. A rope ladder was lowered from the ship's deck, swinging violently with the motion of the waves, making each step a challenge. Rika was the first to climb, holding Rasmus tightly as the boy struggled to keep his balance. Niels remained on the sailboat for a moment longer, watching every move of his wife and son until they were safely aboard. When his turn came, he looked back at the Nuts, now rocking awkwardly, damaged but still afloat. "Wait for me," he murmured to the boat, as if speaking to an old friend. He climbed the ladder quickly, helped by crew members on the deck. Once on the deck, standing beside Rika and Rasmus, Niels saw just how fragile the Nuts appeared now, dwarfed by the vastness of the ocean and the looming shadow of the cargo ship. A lump formed in his throat. He knew something difficult was about to come. On the ship's deck, the captain approached to explain the situation. "We can't tow your sailboat. We don't have the space, and salvage laws don't allow us to assume responsibility for it." Niels listened in silence, processing the words like a punch to the gut. He tried to reason with the captain. "We can help you tow it. That's our home. All our belongings are on it." But the captain remained firm. "You have two options. Abandon it or destroy it to prevent it from becoming a hazard." Rika held Niels's arm, trying to calm him. Rasmus, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, looked around at the tense faces. For Niels, the thought of leaving the Nuts behind was unbearable. That boat wasn't just a mode of transport. It was the symbol of the adventure and freedom they had pursued as a family. With a voice steady but full of emotion, Niels made one final request. "Let me go back down to the boat and retrieve the essentials." The captain agreed, but under one condition. He had to be quick and accompanied by a crew member. Time was running out, and Niels knew he had to act fast. Niels descended back to the Nuts, accompanied by a crew member from the cargo ship. The sailboat rocked more violently than ever, as if resisting the decision to be abandoned. He had only a few minutes to grab everything truly essential. Time seemed to speed up as he moved through the small boat, his mind racing to list items in a desperate sequence. Passports, diaries, clothes for Rasmus. Every item he picked up carried an emotional weight. The ship's log, where he had documented the family's adventure, was in his hands. He hesitated for a second. It was more than just paper and ink. It was proof of everything they had achieved so far. As Niels climbed back to the cargo ship with the few belongings he had managed to save, He looked at the nuts one last time. "It doesn't deserve this," he murmured to the crew member, who nodded, recognizing the sadness in his eyes. With everyone aboard the cargo ship, the captain gave the order, "Release the sailboat." The ropes holding the nuts to the ship were untied, and the small boat began to drift slowly into the Atlantic. Rika held Rasmus's hand as the three of them watched in silence. There was no dramatic explosion or sudden sinking, just the sight of the nuts being carried away by the currents. As if setting off on a journey of its own. For Niels, the scene felt surreal. The sailboat that had accompanied them so far, carrying their dreams and adventures, was now just a distant speck on the horizon. He wanted to believe that, somehow, the nuts would find its way. On the deck of the cargo ship, reality began to sink in. What should have been a rescue now felt like an irreparable loss. "It's like losing a part of ourselves," Rika said softly, her voice full of emotion. Rasmus, who had remained silent until then, asked innocently, "Will we ever see it again?" Niels couldn't answer. He knew the nuts was more than just wood, sails, and ropes. It was their home, the symbol of the freedom they had sought together. Now they were heading toward an uncertain destination, without their boat and with few belongings. Aboard the cargo ship, they were merely passengers, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. For Niels, the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. He knew he had done everything possible to protect his family, but he couldn't escape the bitter taste of losing so much. After 12 days aboard the cargo ship, the family finally arrived at the port of Luanda, Angola. The hot, humid air enveloped them as they disembarked. The dock, bustling with containers and workers, was chaotic, but none of that mattered. What awaited them there was even more unsettling. An uncertain future. They had the bare minimum. Their clothes were worn, and what remained of their belongings fit into a small bag. To make matters worse, Niels was informed that they would have to pay for their return tickets home. A $6,000 debt that seemed impossible to cover at the time. The family found refuge in a simple guest house, sharing a small room as they tried to reorganize their thoughts. For Rasmus, everything was confusing. He gazed out the window at the port as if expecting the nuts to reappear, sailing magically toward them. "When are we going home, Dad?" he asked one night, his voice full of innocence. Niels and Rika, physically and emotionally exhausted, barely had answers. They knew they would need help to get out of this situation, but deep down, they couldn't help but feel abandoned by fate. As they tried to move forward, Niels couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He recorded his emotions in a small notebook he had managed to save. They called it a rescue, but to me, it felt more like a collision. We saved our lives, but we lost everything that brought us here. The cargo ship's logbook, which he had been allowed to see before disembarking, contained a brief and almost indifferent entry. Successful rescue of 3 individuals. For Niels, those words were a painful reminder of how their experience had been treated as a technical operation, with no regard for what they had truly lost. Even so, there was a lesson he and Rika tried to teach Rasmus. That even in the worst situations, it's possible to find the strength to carry on. "The nuts brought us this far," Rika would say, trying to sound optimistic. "And in some way it's still with us." This perspective, though difficult to accept at the time, began to plant a small seed of hope. They didn't know what the future held, but they decided to move forward with the same courage that had led them to embark on the adventure in the first place. Months later, when the nuts had become a painful memory for the family, unexpected news arrived. A Norwegian ship had found a small sailboat adrift in the middle of the Atlantic. The captain, intrigued by the boat's relatively good condition, decided to bring it aboard. The name painted on the side of the hull caught his attention. Nuts. The sailboat that Niels, Rika, and Rasmus had left behind was now safe, hundreds of miles from where they had lost it. The news was relayed through maritime communication networks until it reached Niels. He could hardly believe it. "It can't be," he repeated, looking at Rika, who shared his disbelief. "It survived." For Rasmus, the news brought a smile that hadn't been seen in weeks. "The nuts is coming back." The Norwegian captain made a decision that changed everything. He would take the nuts to Panama, where it could be returned to its rightful owners. The chance to reunite with the boat reignited the family's spirits, and they began planning how to retrieve it. In Panama, the nuts was carefully unloaded and waited for the family it seemed determined to reunite with. When Niels, Rika, and Rasmus finally arrived, they were overcome with emotion. There it was, the small sailboat, marked by its trials but still floating, still intact. "It's as if it fought to come back to us," Rika said, tears in her eyes. Rasmus ran to hug the patched mast, while Niels placed a hand on the hull, as if apologizing for leaving it behind. Recovering the nuts was not just a moment of celebration. It was also a reminder that resilience isn't exclusive to humans. The small sailboat, against all odds, had survived adrift, just as they had survived the challenges of their journey. Now, with the nuts back in their hands, the family was ready to complete the journey they had begun. The Caribbean, which once seemed like a distant dream, was now within reach. The nuts eventually crossed the Atlantic, though not in the way the family had planned. While Niels, Rika, and Rasmus struggled with despair in Angola, the small sailboat braved the currents alone until it was rescued by strangers in the middle of the ocean. The journey was full of setbacks, marked by loss, the improbable, and, in the end, a reconnection. When they finally arrived in the Caribbean, the feeling was different from what they had imagined at the beginning of their voyage. The original dream, though interrupted, had transformed into something much greater. The nuts showed us that the journey doesn't always go as planned, but it's always worth continuing, Niels reflected, watching the sunset in Barbados. Every mark on the sailboat, every patch, was a reminder of the trials they had faced. But above all, it was a symbol of resilience, both of the boat and of the family it carried. The nuts adventure left a legacy that went beyond the Atlantic. For Rasmus, who began the journey as a curious child, the experience was transformative. He grew to understand the value of perseverance, even in the most challenging situations. "I always think about the nuts when something feels impossible," he said years later. For Niels and Rika, the journey was a testament to what it means to trust one another, even when everything seems to fall apart. They learned that the true adventure isn't just about the destination, but what you discover along the way, about the world, about life, and about yourself. The nuts, with its patched sails and weathered hull, became more than a boat. It was proof that even the smallest vessels, when guided by courage and determination, can face the greatest seas. What can we take away from the story of the nuts? This real-life story is a powerful metaphor for life's daily challenges and the resilience needed to face them. In our routine, we often encounter situations that knock us off our planned course. Losses, setbacks, or difficult decisions we must make under pressure. Like Niels and his family, we are constantly challenged to choose between what we want to preserve and what we must leave behind to move forward. One of the main lessons from this story is the value of adaptability. Niels, Rika, and Rasmus faced a series of unexpected events that tested their ability to respond quickly to adversity. In everyday life, this reminds us of the importance of being flexible and prepared to handle the unexpected without losing sight of our bigger goals. Another crucial aspect is the role of solidarity and human connection. The nuts was ultimately rescued because a Norwegian ship chose to act without hesitation. This teaches us that our actions, even seemingly small ones, can positively impact the lives of others. In a world often marked by individualism, the act of helping, even when not asked, can create bonds of empathy that transform lives. There's also a lesson about emotional resilience. The family, even after losing their boat and facing difficult conditions, found the strength to keep going. This teaches us that no matter how hard the moments may be, there is always room to rebuild, recover, and even achieve what once seemed lost. Finally, the story of the nuts reminds us that the true value of our journeys lies not only in the final destination, but also in the experiences, lessons, and connections we make along the way. In daily life, this encourages us to value every moment, to see challenges as opportunities for growth, and to recognize that even the most unpredictable situations can lead to incredible places. This story, like life, challenges us to navigate calm and stormy seas with courage, empathy, and hope. What we take away from it is simple but powerful. Even the smallest boats, like the Nuts, can carry great lessons for those willing to learn. What did you think about this incredible story in the middle of the Atlantic? Do you believe the cargo ship captain handled the rescue of the Nuts properly? Share your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of extraordinary adventures. And if you want to hear about another challenging journey at sea, click on the video now appearing on the screen. I'll leave it here and see you next time.